Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Kathleen Rourke from Candlewick Press, along with our host, Sonja Cherry-Paul, Director of Diversity and Equity at Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. We are very happy and honored to welcome poet, author, and photographer Charles R. Smith, Jr. this evening. Mr. Smith brilliantly fuses his passions of reading, writing, poetry, sports, and photography to create award-winning books for young readers. He is the author of Hoop Queens and its companion Hoop Kings, as well as Pickup Game, One Death, 9 Stories, Chameleon, and 12 Rounds to Glory, a Coretta Scott King Author Award honor book. He is also the recipient of a Coretta Scott King Illustrator Award for his photographs accompanying Langston Hughes' poem, My People. Charles' most recent book with Candlewick Press is Hoop Kings 2, New Royalty. I now turn the conversation over to Sonja and Charles. We invite you to use the comments section to ask questions. Thank you and enjoy the conversation.
Charles, welcome. It's so great to have you on the Black Creator Series.
So glad to be a part of this.
Yeah, so it's National Poetry Month, which is the largest literary celebration in the world. And I imagine as a poet, you celebrate poetry every day. But are there any particular ways you love love poetry this month?
It's funny because as a poet, I always try to, and as an author, I try to make sure I have a social media presence. So I put a lot of pressure on myself for when Poetry Month rolls around. And for me, it's kind of like, well, I just do that all the time. Like I just, when I talk to people, I have that cadence. I use a unique vocabulary. I always make a point of using a unique vocabulary. So I really do embody being a poet. And so, it may sound like a little bit of a cop-out, like I don't do this specifically or do that specifically. But when it's a part of you, it's very easy. I love taking walks. And whenever I take walks, I'm mentally crafting lines in my head, whether they rhyme or, just a visual picture that I write in my head. But, it's a part of me, 24/7, 365.
When you visit schools and speak with students, do you feel that poetry has an indelible place in their hearts and in their lives in the way that you've just described? You see poetry in your walks, you hear, poetry in your minds. And do you feel that young people have that experience? And what can educators do to make sure of this, to make poetry central in children's lives?
Yeah, I don't know how big of a part of it is to a child in terms of the way that I grasp it, because again, I've got a few years on the kids, but also just as something that's what I am and that's what I do. Part of that was from my developing a love of words early on. And I'm old enough to have come of age at a time when hip hop was invented. And so I got to see music merged with rhyme. And when that happened, that immediately latched me even more on to poetry, which I was already interested in. But hearing this music accompany it made it far more accessible. And I think the challenge with teachers these days is not so much making it accessible to kids, but finding something that they will latch on to in the poetry. Because for me, it was rhyme, it was the cadence, it was the rhythm. For some kids, we're in a very visual age. So if they see it on the page and there's words swimming across the page, that may look a lot more interesting and inviting to just actually hearing it. So I think the big key is just exposing kids to as much variety of poetry as possible. Because one of the jokes that I make when I do a poetry writing workshop at schools is I say, we're going to blow the dust off of poetry, because we often hold poetry up as like this thing and like, oh, it's so hard to teach. And, oh, you got to treat it with such care. And then, we make it like a museum quality kind of thing. And by doing that, you automatically put it out of the grasp of kids, as opposed to saying, hey, even taking a lyric from a rap artist or a hook from a music piece or even a commercial these days, poetry is meant to stay with you. And we have so many ways that it does exist, but we don't call it poetry, And so, again, we're a very visual medium, and an Instagram post, which is a visual, that's visual poetry, and if kids can latch on and see things in a unique way, that helps to make that connection to poetry.
I think that's so important for educators to hear. I love that you called it this museum kind of approach, this archaic way in which poetry can be presented to young children. And then as teachers, we like to get mad when kids are not feeling, as passionately about this thing, but, look how we have propped this up, as opposed to an approach that says poetry is all around you. And I love the blowing the dust off of poetry. What kind of writer were you as a young person?
Well, I was a voracious reader, first and foremost. And as you read, when you get writing assignments in school, they're very easy. And I try to get this point across to teachers, and they understand, but I really try to focus on the kids understanding that, if your teacher says, write a 500-word story on something, well, if your vocabulary is limited, those 500 words are going to be tough to get to. But if your vocabulary is immense, and you've immersed yourself in a variety of different ways of storytelling, of way speech is used, then it becomes a much easier activity for you to do. So for me, taking what I was reading, that developed that understanding and learning of words, so that when I came down to the concentration of it in poetry, then all the fluff words are out, no articles, no conjunctions, no adverbs, all of that stuff gets skimmed away. And then you're left with this, concentrate of like orange juice, I like to say. And you're left with that concentrate that makes it, every word you have to kind of slow down. And that's what, I got out of it when I started getting into it. I was able to enjoy it right away because there was no fluff in it. There was no 25-word sentence that was really long to work my way through. It was a simple poem, and I either got it or I didn't, which is one of the other things that I really impress upon the teachers. Instead of asking, what was the poet thinking when they wrote this? How about, did you like it? No. Okay, move on. There's a million poems to learn from, rather than to take the one that we like as the teacher and the instructor and force this one onto kids. We may love it, but they may not have any interest, and they may love something that you may not have, latched on to. That, again, that's why it goes back to that whole variety thing, because there's so many doors, that poetry can open in different ways.
Yeah. So important. Sometimes, as teachers, we become so invested in the thing that we love, we strangle the life out of it, right? And so I love that, one important message for educators is to just expose children to as much poetry as possible, and to ask them, what do they like about it, right? Not what did the poet think and what was the poet feeling, but how are you receiving this? Yeah. I think that's really a powerful message. Now, you've written several books about basketball. Mm-hmm. What is it about this game that captivates you?
Well, there's a funny story, and I'll tell this here specifically because my editor is now Kendall Wick's publisher and president. She was the one that signed up my very first book called Rim Shots. And Rim Shots is based on street basketball. It's a collection of poems, stories, and what I call other stuff, And she loved the pictures. And when I told her I could write it, and once it was done and everything, she says, you're now going to be known as the basketball guy. And I laughed. I'm like, well, okay, if somebody has to wear that mantle, I'll do it, but I'll prove myself otherwise. And so for me, I think for many young Black men growing up in the country, that's one of your first heroes. I mean, I had a father in the house, and so he was definitely an inspiration. Many young Black men, unfortunately, do not have an adult male figure in the house. And so the celebrities, the athletes, they take on that role of a role model. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case for me, because like I said, my father was in the house. So for me, it was about the artistry and the drama of the game itself. And then as I got older, it bonded me with my family, with my dad in particular, with my friends. It introduced me to other people. It has now made a career for myself. Yeah. And so I said, when she said that, I said, well, if people are going to know me as a basketball guy, then I'll be the best one. And so it's funny because I actually literally I was just going through my social media, and somebody had posted something on Instagram about my newest book, Who Kings 2, how they loved it. It's great for poetry and reluctant readers and everything. And that's kind of the point. Like, if I'm going to be the basketball guy, then I'm going to be the basketball guy. Yeah. And then I knew that I am capable enough as a writer and a poet and an author to branch out, which I've since done. But the big thing for me is that basketball, I'm a big sports person in general, because as a photographer, I really enjoy the visual of things, of, seeing a pitcher wind up, go in motion, a batter swing the bat, a jump shot, a crossover. Like I really like seeing lacrosse, field goal happening. I like seeing movement, the body move. Yeah. And as a poet, we like to write about pretty things. Of course, we can write about ugly things too, but we write about things that captivate us, that, catch our eye to make us observe it and write upon it. And basketball has just been really easy for me to do that.
I was a 5th, 6th, and 7th grade teacher for about 20 years. And my 5th and 6th grade students in particular were obsessed with rim shots and short takes. They wore that book out. I mean, like, they were getting Scotch tape to take the pages back in. And as they studied your work with these texts, and I observed, what they loved about it. And it wasn't just kids who loved sports. Obviously, that was a big draw for many kids. Mm-hmm. But they noticed the way that you capture rhythm and movement. As I was listening to you talk about basketball, and they could see that, the rhythm and movement with words on the page. What advice do you have for young writers of poetry?
I think the biggest thing is to be inspired by things other than words. I'm heavily influenced by comic books. I loved comic books when I was a kid. I love going to museums. The Met is one of my favorites. I love particularly like abstract paintings. Some of the big gargantuan, European paintings, that scale. I love movies. I love watching things where nice things happen, ballet. I've never sat through a ballet, but, I always enjoy watching imagery from that. And I think that's the big thing, is trying to tap into the rhythm of something. And by that, I mean that everything has a heartbeat to it. And when you can tap into the heartbeat of something, what is it, the soul of it? What is it? What is the thing that makes that go? What is it that, taps into that? Even if you go shopping, a retail store, the type of retail store, is it a store? Is it like a big, nice, fancy store where the floor is really nice and it smells nice? Or is it a very different kind of store where everybody's really close to each other and fighting each other and things like that? Everything has a heart to it. And when you can find what the heart is in something, and, a heart has a rhythm, it has a beat to it. And, it's actually a medical condition if your heart doesn't beat on a regular rhythm. You know what I mean? And so once you find the heart of something, then you're usually able to get to the rhythm of it. And the rhythm may not necessarily be immediately repetitive, like a bum, 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 bum. It may be a much longer, drawn out, you know, bum, 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 you know, but if you watch and observe something long enough, you can tap into that rhythm. And, you know, like for me, when hip hop was invented, that was a big thing for my poetry, because now I really had music going along to, you know, rhyme. And granted, it wasn't the same kind of rhyme, you know, that it was back then that it is now. It was much more rudimentary, but it was still this kind of words going in lockstep, you know, with the beat, you know, that helped me get the basics of rhythm. And then as I would write about different sports, then I would tap into the rhythm of sports or whatever it is that I'm writing about. So like, for instance, I just finished a number of soccer poems. Soccer is a very fast-paced sport. So the poems, I'm not going to be writing haikus. You know, I'm not writing sonnets. I'm not writing where it's a very slow pace. You know, it's free verse, boom, boom, boom. Every other word is rhyming. You know, there's a lot of internal rhyme. It's really fast moving. Some words are repeated. Some words rhyme with another word and then another word and another, you know, it takes its cue from that. And all of my poetry, I try to take my cue from the subject to, you know, get me into the rhythm of what it is I want to say.
You know, this might sound really obvious, but, you know, how important is it for young people to not only read poetry, but to read poetry out loud? I think there are some classrooms where, you know, kids have access to poetry to read, but I don't know if there's always an invitation for them to read it out loud. And I wonder if that helps with, you know, them capturing rhythm and movement. Is this advice that you might share with young people and with educators who teach poetry?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you definitely have to read poems out loud, because some poems are written to be spoken out loud. Just like some poems are written to be read on a page. For instance, you mentioned my book, Short Takes, which was my third book. When I would speak in schools, I was trying to figure out, okay, which of these poems am I going to perform? You know, rim shots had been out, and I knew which poem I was going to perform because of the way that it lent itself to being performed. But for Short Takes, I just wasn't sure. I knew I was going to do one, but I'm like, well, maybe I'll do like a haiku. And I did, and it just falls flat. And it's not because of the haiku, but it's because when you're an audience, you know, your attention is not 100% there. It may be 95%, but it's still not 100% there. And a haiku, that 5% could be a syllable that you missed that make the whole poem. You know what I'm saying? And so I understood that, okay, a haiku is not going to work. It's got to be something where I can use my hands to bring about a visual image in people's head and then take them along the ride for that. And so, you know, poetry definitely has to be read out loud. But I think the big thing is educators letting students know, asking them, you know, hey, would you read this out loud? Or do you think this would be better read to yourself? Because some kids are going to read it out loud. But let's face it, in this day and age, most kids, they want to crawl and hide behind themselves, you know? Yeah. And part of that is the nature of our society with the way that anxiety is taking over and such. But the flip side of that is, yeah, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, I'm ready to read it. I got blah, 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 you know? And I think we need to treat both of those equally, you know, because somebody could have written an awesome poem and want to read it out loud, and then it falls flat because it's not meant to be read out loud. Just the same as somebody may write something really great that they're afraid to read, and maybe the teacher reads it to somebody else and is like, wow, you know. But I think they need to be given equal weight because they are two different kinds of poems, honestly.
Can you talk a little bit about how the Hoop series came about?
Yes. So let's start with the Hoop Kings, because that's the one that kind of started it all. After my editor, like I said, Karen Lotz, who is now runs Candlewick, I did my first book. She edited my first book at a different publisher. And so years later, when she moved, then, we struck again and decided to do this, which was on pro basketball. So I knew I was going to do a book on the men. So then the question was, okay, will they bite on doing a book on the women, which they did. And the funny thing is, at this instance, at this stage, the WNBA was still pretty young. It was novel, so it was drawing enough attention, but it was still young. And since it was young, the players, you had to really hunt for them. And this was before YouTube was what it is. So I literally had to actually watch the games. I couldn't watch clips, like I would now. I couldn't just go to YouTube and type in a name and see everything pop up. But I had actually had, when I worked as a commercial photographer, one of my previous assignments was photographing the first WNBA All-Star game. And I got to stand up close and personal with these women. Some were much taller than me. Some were about the same size. Some were smaller. Many were about the same size or taller, but they all had that basketball grit and mentality. So I just looked at them as, okay, this is the WNBA's, best athletes. This is the NBA's best athletes. This is the WNBA's best athletes. And so I really made a point to make each poem, like that one, The Chef, that's the one that I normally perform in schools. And when I speak to kids about it is I say, okay, the first thing I had to think about is her name is Tisha Pinachero, and she plays the position of point guard. A point guard is effectively, their job is to pass or feed the ball to their teammates. So I focused on that word feed and said, who is somebody that feeds people? And I said, a cook. Nope, even better, a chef. And I personally love to cook. I love watching Food Network and such. And this was, again, at the infant stage of the Food Network. It was long before the, celebrity chefs and all of that stuff. It was at the very beginning when it was just basic cooking shows. And so I remember sitting down and writing down cooking verbs because when you write about sports, the focus should be on action. And every sport has different types of action. And so I decided to take the actions from cooking and apply them to basketball. And when I mention that to kids, I have to say, okay, first of all, give me some verbs that relate to cooking and I remind them, verbs are verbs, not adjectives, the actions. Just think of some of the things you actually do on the court. And so once I kind of hit upon that idea of watching them play and then equating it to something else, then I came up with kind of the formula for how I do the poems. So every player now, I basically just watch them and I write down words that come to my head when I see them. So in the case of Cheryl Swoops at the time, she was the Michael Jordan of the WNBA. She was the best. She did it all. And so I would just write down all of the things that she did. And there was a really long list. And so I made up little different names. So you see like the lane spinner, championship winner, ball stripper, defense slipper. So certain things started to rhyme, but it all came from me just jotting down words from watching her play. So those words effectively, like a recipe, become the ingredients for what you're going to make.
Right.
With Hoop Kings 2, I had always hoped that we would do a follow-up to Hoop Kings 1 because there's so many great players that thankfully, I got a chance to do that. And so, I picked out my 12 players, which is always the toughest because the book is not going to come out right after you write it. So you have to pick players that are going to have some lasting power. The flash in the pan rookie may not work out, or they may be the next big thing. So, that's always the big challenge when you do something where you're focusing on contemporary individuals. How long are they going to be contemporary?
Right. And I would be remiss if I did not ask for any kids in the who are watching. Mm-hmm. Have you had the privilege of meeting any of these players, Charles?
Unfortunately, not the new Hoop Kings, but I did meet several of the original Hoop Kings, including
Ah.
Shaquille O'Neal. I met him. I met Allen Iverson. I think I met a few other ones. I actually met, like it's funny because the NBA just celebrated their 75th anniversary this year. For the 50th anniversary, I was able to meet all 50 of the greatest NBA players because I was still working as a commercial photographer. And we had an assignment to photograph the all-star players of that time. So I got to meet a lot of those players in Hoop Kings original when they were young, like rookies or so, because Michael Jordan was still playing. And a lot of those guys, like your Chris Webbers and Tim Duncans, they were, rookies and such.
You are a photographer, a poet, an avid basketball fan who was influenced by hip hop. How did you, or when did you figure out you could put all of this together, that your work could sit at the intersection of these things that you love?
Honestly, I didn't. I mentioned Karen, my president at Candlewick, because she and the art director that was working for her at the time, Sarah Reynolds, they kind of discovered me because I was there to try to get work as a book cover photographer. Novelists use photographs. So I was just hoping to do that. And the black and white basketball series that will become Rim Shots was just part of my portfolio. And they both saw something there like, wow, this would be really great. Now, to my credit, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back or anything like that, but just to my credit, once I had the book out, because even when I did the book, I'm still thinking commercial photography. But once the book came out and I started speaking at schools and started seeing the response that it was getting, I said, man, I got to do more of these. Yeah. And so, I actually got into photography through writing, and I got back into writing through photography. So they were definitely meant to be together for me. My goal when I worked in commercial photography was I wanted to write for Rolling Stone magazine. They would have like the interview. So I wanted to do the photograph and the interview. I never figured out interview skills, so I really couldn't go that route. But I always wanted to tie, it was kind of ironic that I always wanted to tie words and images together. And that when I got to do the book, even though they seemed kind of separate, once I started seeing the response, and they made sense together. And then I just pushed forward in that direction.
You've also written about other sports and athletes like Muhammad Ali. So I want to just share 12 Rounds of Glory, the story of Muhammad Ali, which is a stunning collaboration between you and the incredible illustrator, Brian Collier. There's so many stories and nuances within the stories of Ali's life. And I'm wondering, what was the research process like for you? Was there anything that surprised you? And also, what was the process like of then creating the beautiful prose that would be reflective of his life and the man, Ali?
I don't know if there was anything that really surprised me, because having done a number of biographies, one thing that I realized about when I do biographies is I really don't go in with any preconceived notions. That's kind of the best way to go into a biography, because if you kind of go in thinking I'm going to show this, that may be one direction, but if you go in thinking this, you're only going to look there. You're not going to keep yourself open to everything else. And so I really just made a point of just looking at his story from a variety of different points of view. I didn't want to rely on just his words, and I never rely on any one person's words. But I knew that I wanted to show how he became the man that he became. And I think if anything surprised me, it was the true humility that he exhibited in his actions on a regular basis, as I will just see things about him and learn about him. But at the same time, some of the meanness that he had towards opponents or people that had wronged him or something, something in that regard. and I don't mean mean and vindictive or things like that, but the level of passion that he could get worked up against some opponents where it was true, you know, but at the same time, like I said, seeing the humility. The great thing about this book is this was basically my master's in writing. I became a different writer after this book because the books that I'd written up until this point were all just simply poems. This was my first real story that was told through verse. And so I wanted to get it right. And so, you know, the research took a certain amount of time. The revisions took a certain amount of time. The imagery took a certain amount of time. And when I was finished with it, I felt like I had an award winner on my hand. And it wasn't so much like, oh, I'm going to win an award. It was, to me, it was like, wow, this is really good. Like, you know, I was really proud of myself for, you know, getting the deal and getting to do the book and then completing it, not only the way that I wanted to, but the way that I felt that he deserved.
Yeah.
And so once I got, you know, the finished artwork and everything in my hand and saw the whole package, and I was just really, you know, blown away and just really happy for it.
Yeah. It's a stunning biography in prose that, you know, I know will help young readers learn about Ali as a champion boxer and a world champion activist who was willing to put it all on the line for truth and for justice. And it also is another beautiful mentor that demonstrates that biography doesn't have to just look one way, like a 5-paragraph essay, right? Yeah. That its structure and its form can be poetry. Charles, what's now and next for you? Are there any new projects you're working on?
Oh, I have always a bunch of things I'm working on. I'm happy to say I've completed more books for Candlewick with other sports that I'm very excited for people to see so that they can see, you know, me branching out, not just in poetry, but in subject matter. I have a number of books that I've completed that'll be out over the next few years, which I'm very excited about because I basically just decided, you know, as much as I would love to do a novel, I have one novel, as much as I would love to do another one, shorter form or something, I've embraced the mantle of, you know, poet. And, you know, one of the things that I bristle at a little, people say my hip hop poetry is like, no, it's poetry. I've written a villanelle, I've written a sonnet, I've written sestinas, I've written poetry and they exist across a variety of my books. So it's like, all right, let's tap into that and really move in that lane and take advantage of it as best as I can. So to that end, you know, I have more biographies coming out about different types of people in different fields, different sports, different you know, different things, you know, different styles, different genres and, you know, formats. So I'm just excited to see it all, not just with my words, but with my camera too, because, you know, doing the words and the photography allows me to work quicker. You know, I can have a book done pretty quick, which means it'll be out pretty quick. Yeah. So, which as a creator is a big thing because now, you know, it becomes incumbent upon me to generate the work. And so that's what I'm most excited for now is to, you know, just continue, you know, taking this mantle of a poet and really, you know, pushing the envelope with it.
Well, we are excited for all of it and we are here for all of it. Is there a poem that you might read to us?
Well, if you've seen me speak before, you know I don't read my poems, I perform them.
So,
yes. So I was thinking about this, and it's actually a book that you mentioned. It won't be Rim Shots, but it is from my third book, Short Takes. And it got excerpted by Miss Nikki Giovanni in a collection of poetry that she did. And it's one of my favorite poems to do. And it kind of represents me and my style of work that I do. And it's called Allow Me to Introduce Myself. They call me the showstopper, the dime dropper, the spin move to the left, reverse jam popper, the high flyer on the high wire, the intense rim rattling noise amplifier, the net shaker, backboard breaker, creator of the funky dunk, hip shaker, the man, so slam, the legend I be. That's just a few of the names they call me.
When we children and adults read your books, your identities, your background, your experiences shine across each page and each poem. You've written in Hoop Kings that watching Magic Johnson play is poetry in motion, but now I get to say that you indeed are poetry in motion. By bringing your full self to your work, it's a powerful invitation for young readers to do so as well. What does it mean to you to be a Black creator?
Well, I mean, I first look at the creator part of it because I really think it's a privilege to be able to be a creator, to be able to take things around you and turn them into something that could inspire people. It seems like, I don't want to say it seems like a silly thing, but it does seem like a silly thing to think that, okay, what is my job? My job is to observe and comment on what it is that I see. And to be able to have that power is great just as a creator. To be a Black creator, for better or for worse, comes responsibility. Better because the responsibility that I myself as a Black man can be a voice for young Black students and any student, therefore, to experience some of the things that I've experienced. The worse in that sometimes as a Black creator, I may not be able to be given the same free reign of subject matter that some others might. So to respond to that challenge, though, I decided that I am just going to focus on what is unique to me. And when I was a younger me, what would I have liked? And young me was always very different. So the things that I'm going to like are going to be very different. And I try to speak to that young person that is different, that has different interests. My most recent book on Jimi Hendrix, how much more different can you get than that? Even writing poems about basketball players, that's something, unique and different. And so, taking that role of a Black creator, I appreciate it. And I respect the challenge, that it presents, but also I'm so excited to be able to bring my talents, to be able to create.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation and will use Charles's many books in your classrooms and across your curriculum to inspire students to write their own poetry, to express themselves and all that they are passionate about. Please join us in May for our last episode this season, a conversation with author Janet Costa Bates, whose picture book, Time for Bed, Old House, received 4-star reviews, and who has an exciting new chapter book series coming in fall 2022. For a full schedule of conversations and to view past episodes, please visit blackcreatorseries.candlewick.com.